Hi, welcome to More Orthodoxy. This is a channel dedicated to Orthodox, Catholic and Protestants alike. Today I'm joined by Dr. Kevin Vost. We're here to discuss his life and work. So Kevin, welcome to More Orthodoxy.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, Marcus. I'm really excited about chatting with you today.
Thank you very much. So just to begin then, I'll give people a bit of background about you. I'll say that you have innumerable achievements, it seems, and written so many books. You're an author, a speaker, a professor, a many-time radio and TV guest. You've been in EWTN, Catholic Answers, and elsewhere. And your academic background is in clinical psychology, and you've been involved with everyone from Mensa to the International Association of Resistance Trainers. So just touching upon some of those key interests then, how did you come to write so many books? Because what is it now, stand at 20 or?
Yeah, there are 20 out, and I just finished the rough first draft of the 21st, and I have a few more in mind. But I guess with that background, yeah, you probably could say I'm one of those guys who's a jack of all trades, but maybe a master of none. But I kind of try to write about the things where these different areas kind of intersect and overlap. So there are some themes that go through there. But how did I come to write so many? Well, how did I become an author is just that I love books, So most of my life I was a very, very big reader. Also in my early 30s, while I was working full time, I had the chance to go back and get a doctorate in clinical psychology. I already had a master's, and we had to do a lot of writing. So I had to really develop the ability to write quickly. So that's kind of served me well. I'm also an early riser by nature, so I can do much of my work early in the morning while the rest of the house sleeps. And thank God, I tend to be pretty fluent in my writing. I'm not a person who tends to get blocks. So usually if I get myself to sit down and get down to business with a big cup of coffee, I can usually be productive. So for those reasons, it's worked out for me to be able to produce quite a few books in the last, the last 16 years, I think. Yeah.
Marvelous. Just on psychology then, just one of those trades, I would argue you've mastered numerous trades, but just one of those then, what drew your interest in psychology?
Yeah, from my late teens, I was always very, very interested in philosophy. I'd read some very nice, engaging books, a couple by Will Durant, The Story of Philosophy and The Mansions of Philosophy. So I loved, pursuing those big ideas like, well, what's true and how should we live and how do we know if we're reasoning properly and so forth. So I was really drawn to philosophy, but I was also a very shy person in a homebody. In my own city, the Catholic junior college, the secular community college, the university, none of them had a philosophy major. So I took psychology as kind of a second best. Thought, well, that's the closest thing, and it really worked out well. I've also been interested in psychology, and personally not as much in abnormal psychology as in like normal human development and cognition, kind of like, how can we improve all these God-given abilities that God has given us, to think and to find truth and to control our emotions and things like that. So yeah, I switched my major to psychology, I think in my late teens or early 20s, and I've kind of stuck with it since.
Marvelous then. So obviously, as well as working out your mind rigorously, you've worked out your body and you've an interest in all things physical. What sort of drew your interest to bodybuilding and things like that and weightlifting?
Sure, I'll tell you, it started very, very early because as a young child, I was obsessed with the Superman character. I watched on these old television shows from the 1950s and I thought, wow, this guy's amazing. He's so strong and can do all these things. And yet, being here in the United States, his motto was truth, justice, and the American way. So he used all this strength, for good. So when I was very, very little, I wanted to be Superman. And a few years went by, I realized that's not going to happen. But I remember seeing a weightlifter on TV when I was like about in second grade. And I kind of demanded that my dad get me some barbell plates at that point, and he did. Mm-hmm. So even from 7 or 8 years old, I've had weights. And from about the 7th grade, I think, I trained regularly at home for a few years and then in gyms. So it's just always been something that I've enjoyed as a passion and a hobby. I did a little bit of actual bodybuilding, physique competition in my teenage years, but it's been mostly powerlifting and strength training. I focus more on function, you might say, than form, being strong, being able to do things. And for me, if it makes your muscles, bigger and fuller, that's just kind of like a nice side effect, but that's not my primary focus.
Amazing. So just more generally then, what have been some of the key events in your personal life that have kind of forged your personality?
Sure, I'll just give a real brief rundown. I was raised a Catholic, went to Catholic schools with Dominican sisters in grade school, Victorian priests and brothers in high school. I got married in 1984 at age 23. My wife and I have had two sons that are 33 and 27 now. The same year I got married in 84, I took a job in disability adjudication. I was a state employee of the state of Illinois where I live, but we did these mental and physical cases for Social Security disability, in the United States. And I actually kept doing that for 32 years while I dabbled in some of these other things. In my early 30s, I had the opportunity to go back and get a doctorate degree in clinical psychology, while working full-time through everything except my last year where I had to do dissertation and internship. And so that was big. I was able to do my dissertation work and internship at a medical school, working with Alzheimer's patients and other people with dementias and different kinds of brain damage, and also normal control volunteers, people who have different ages, who would come in and let us test them, their memories, their language abilities, and so on, to kind of see what's a normal pattern. How do these things change as we get old? So that was a big thing. Moving along, I retired from my full-time state work in 2016. Oh, in the meanwhile, I also did college teaching on the side as an adjunct. I did that the last time a few years ago for some Dominican sisters down in Nashville. I think it was in 2006, my first Catholic book came out. And since then, I've also been busy doing those. And then a lot of, radio and podcasts and some live talks and things have come from that.
Marvelous. Can you speak broadly then to major changes in your worldview and your reconversion? We can touch upon this later and go into more detail with looking at your book. But can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. To make this very, very brief, I was raised, a Christian, a Catholic. In my late teens, I read some of what I would now consider the wrong kind of philosophy. Atheists like Friedrich Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell from over there in England, Ayn Rand, and some others. And they convinced me that it wasn't rational to believe in God. So I actually spent 25 years considering myself an atheist, because I thought I was seeking truth. And I thought I just couldn't honestly believe that God exists based on these arguments I had read. Well, 25 years later, I read St. Thomas Aquinas, and I am wowed, and I decide that these arguments I'd been living with 25 years had already been answered many centuries ago. Mm-hmm. So I was able to come back to Christ in the church when I was 43 years old in 2004. So the main thing that's changed is I sought truth the whole time. I believed in trying to be virtuous, but I didn't think God was necessary or real. And now I do, and it makes a profound difference. Thanks be to God.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. So on the more positive side then, who would have been some of those key influences that you found particularly inspirational or influential in, I suppose, your personal life and your academic life?
Yes. I was thinking about this. I'll narrow it down to maybe 5 or 6. Being interested in philosophy, the philosopher Aristotle, mm-hmm. and his view of, what sometimes we call the correspondence theory of truth. We have truth as human beings when what we think matches with the external world, with reality. There's an actual correspondence there, So it's saying that, yeah, we do have the capacity to gain the truth. It starts with our senses, but works through our intellect. So Aristotle, in his writings on ethics and metaphysics and logics, had a big influence on me, both during my atheist years and now. Also, 3 thinkers, the great Stoic philosophers, Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, they had a huge impact on me in terms of what really related to ethics and psychology, how we can effectively control our emotions and not let anger take us over, or fear, things like that. And they were also very, very influential on the modern theories of cognitive psychotherapy, which I first learned in school. Then 2 more, St. Thomas Aquinas, maybe we'll talk more about him later. He's probably been the predominant figure. It was through reading him that I came back to the church. He also just built magnificently upon the writings of Aristotle, and he was also very well versed in the writings of the Latin writing Stoic, Seneca. So in a sense, for me, when I got Thomas Aquinas, it's like I'm getting all my favorites in one. And one other figure has been important because I wrote a biography of him, is St. Albert the Great, who is Thomas Aquinas' teacher and the patron saint of science. So he's another person like St. Thomas who kind of synthesized the best of what was out there in terms of pagan philosophy, Christian wisdom, wisdom that came from the ancient church fathers and doctors. So if I just narrow down to 6 intellectual influences anyway: Aristotle, Epictetus, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Thomas Aquinas, and St. Albert the Great.
Amazing. So this comes across whenever one reads your books. If we might now, could we take a look at some of your individual works and communicate some of your deep interests and insights?
Sure, I'd love to.
Excellent. So recently I've been reading Porch and the Cross, which deals with some of those Stoic figures that you mentioned. I just want to know, Stoicism seems to be booming at the moment. It's on YouTube channels, podcasts. There's movie reviews centered around Stoicism. I think the author Ryan Holiday has brought it to light for many people, and the Art of Manliness podcast. I just wondering why you think this renaissance is occurring predominantly now in Stoicism and all things Stoic.
Yeah, and one, it sure is. All those influencers are definitely growing. I've been fortunate to be involved with some of those, writing for some different Stoic podcasts and so on. I think, there's many reasons, but I think part of it is, in the last century or so, we had so much of a rejection of our traditional values, of our Orthodox past, that someone would speak of a post-Christian world. This idea of relativism, this is my truth, what's your truth? There is no truth. It just left so many people feeling up in the air, well, what am I to believe? Is there anything what can sustain me, And among the Stoics, you find a lot of basic common truths that kind of apply to all humanity through all the ages, based on our reason, kind of the nature of what we are as human beings. What is it to have reasons, to have emotions, to have passions, to have desires to do things that maybe are really harmful to us? So they have a lot of very practical, common, and enduring wisdom there that can be helpful to all of us.
Mm-hmm. Something that comes across for me with this is kind of like the appeal of Jordan Peterson, particularly to men, and it's a tougher life and stuff like this here.
Yes.
People want to take up their cross and become more active, kind of linked to what you said about going beyond I'm okay, you're okay kind of relativism. But something I think that I respect even more about your book in particular is that you show it's not just for males, that Stoicism and different Stoic authors are for everybody, really.
Yes, exactly. And one of the earliest Stoics, a man we don't often hear as much about because we have so very little of his work, is a man named Musonius Rufus, who was the teacher of Epictetus, one of the most prominent Stoics. And Epictetus does refer to him very, very with great respect many times. But yeah, in some of the fragments we have from Musonius's lectures, which may actually be kind of Q&A after his lectures, he talks specifically about the fact that in terms of our capacity of intellect and capacity for virtue, men and women are equal. He said that women should study philosophy. They should develop virtues. Women, just like men, need to be courageous. And I love he gives some examples from nature, how hens will protect their little chicks from bigger, much more powerful predators. But yeah, he's saying that women have the same dignity as men. They should always be trained and also be trained in the same important things in life. He says, yeah, there are some, of course, there's obviously physical differences. And some particular activities will be better adapted for the strengths of men or the strengths of women. But in terms of the things that matter the most, in terms of finding the truth and living lives of virtue, that applies to both men and women in virtually exactly the same way. So all kinds of really profound insights there in Musonius Rufus, and the dignity and respect that he held for women is one of the things too, I think, that really helps draw some modern, not only men, but women in.
Mm-hmm. Marvelous. So that's one thing that I think that makes your book distinct. What else makes your book on Stoicism distinct from the others that are out there?
Okay, yeah, I'll just a basic description. There's 4 parts, and each part focuses on one major figure: Musonius Rufus, Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius. Each part has 3 chapters. The first is a mini biography of that Stoic, and here's the main reason I did that. Stoicism is also often called an art of living. It's not just some philosophical system that you learn and memorize. Its goal is to help you live your life, to be more happy, to be a more virtuous person, to be more helpful to your fellow man. So if that's the whole goal of this philosophy, hopefully we would see it acted out in the lives of these philosophers themselves. So I try to show that with starting each part with a brief mini biography of that philosopher. Then there's a second chapter that's kind of just a summary of some of their most profound works and sayings. So I give like abridgments in my own words, modern language, of just a sample of some of their key thoughts. And then a third chapter I call a legacy chapter. And there's two main components to this. One, this is where I kind of open up to commentary. I kind of give you my own takes on this. Maybe how their ideas relate to some modern ideas in psychotherapy or in the research on parenting styles, all kinds of different things. But I also talk about how thinkers in later centuries have made use of these Stoic ideas. What ideas did they reject? And in this particular book, I had a very strong emphasis on Christian views of the Stoics. The early church fathers, what did they have to say about them as men? Which of their ideas did they build upon? For example, for Epictetus' brief little handbook, kind of a summary of his teachings, there have been at least, 3 Christianized versions of this book, found that were made throughout the Middle Ages. One of them was found in the library of the Vatican, and they basically adapted Epictetus' little handbook for use by monks. And sometimes they Christianized it, for example, by if he referred to Socrates, they might change that to say St. Paul, So interesting adaptations there, but people found them valuable. Or in the case of Seneca, I zoom in on how St. Thomas Aquinas made use of Seneca in his great Summa Theologica, looking at, among other things, the way Seneca treated the virtue of gratitude, the way he looked at the human passion of anger, and in several other places there. So through my book, you'll find a mini biography, you'll find a summary of some of the key teachings, and then you take a survey of what people have made, especially Christians, have made of the Stoic thought throughout the centuries.
So that's excellent. Thank you, Kevin. I was just wondering then, for you personally, I suppose we've already went through it a wee bit, but what are some of the best parts of Stoicism? And then where do you think it actually does fall short of the cross and resurrection of Christ, as it were?
Okay, sure. And to tie in the Christian theme to begin with, Christ told us, the great commandment is to love God with all that we are and to love our neighbors as ourselves. And I say, in some sense, the Stoics have such a great value because they can be instruments or tools that can help us do just that. Because we can have a hard time focusing on God and what he wants of us and our neighbors and in their needs and on proper care of ourselves. That's hard to do if we're distracted because we're angry at someone or we're envious of what our neighbor, that new car they just pulled into their driveway, or if we're fearful about something we have to do, some speech we have to make or some task we have to do. So the Stoics can give us this technology to rein in our emotions and our fears to help us focus on what's important, the things that God has called us to do. So that's one in general, a very important thing that we get from the Stoics. Now, as far as a limitation, it's interesting because different Stoics will have different takes here. They did not know Christ. A few of them make vague references to Christianity, like they may have had some knowledge of it, but they're writing either before Christ or in the early centuries of Christianity, didn't really know him well, but based on reason, they're trying to, most of them find some kind of a God. It may be wrapped up a little bit in pantheism. At times, they'll talk about the polytheism of the Greeks. Often they speak of God in a sense of a capital G, like in a personal way. So they're kind of, groping for God as the Father. Oh, Rufus even says that we're made in God's image, as we find in our Christian Bible. But, but they didn't know Christ himself. They didn't know that God had become man. So in a sense, Christianity, of course, gives us what the Stoics were groping for, reaching for with their reason. And really then Christianity fulfills it. I say, Christ came, not to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. I'd say in some sense, too, he didn't destroy the natural lessons we learned from the Stoics. He fulfilled them and pointed even beyond their noble teachings. Excellent.
Thank you, Kevin. So another work that you've done is on loneliness, the Catholic Guide to Loneliness. I was just wondering what made you write a book about this particular topic?
Now, that's a really good question, Marcus, because most of the books, I think of these ideas and I propose them to publishers. This is one of the few that a publisher asked me to write. A few years ago, it was Charlie McKinney over at Sophia Institute Press, and I guess it had come to his awareness of a growing literature on loneliness as an epidemic. And I know that Sophia had published a very successful book before this called The Catholic Guide to Depression. It was by a psychiatrist and a priest. So the idea is, here is a phenomenon that's really impacting people today. Both Catholics, Protestants, non-believers, people who believe in other religions, just the whole gamut. So what can we do to help them? Providing information both from actual psychology, research and science and therapy, and also from the tradition of our Catholic faith. So they asked me, because they knew my background in clinical psychology, and I was happy to take on this project. And when I did, I myself at the time was not aware of the magnitude of the problem, of the growing research, of all the implications. So to me, it was a real eye-opener to do the research for that book, because again, it opened my own eyes to just how prevalent and just how important the issue is.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think it predominantly that it is such a problem nowadays, especially in a technological age where in some ways we're never really alone, and there's a constant noise going on, and we're allegedly more connected than ever? Why do you think that? It sounds like a paradox, maybe it's not, but why do you think that is?
Yeah, there's definitely some paradoxical elements there. And Marcus, I'll describe the way that a lot of the research summarizes loneliness as kind of two key dimensions. And you can have one or the other or both. But one they call a sense of perceived like a social isolation. Like maybe you do have a wife, a significant other, some good close friends that you can relate to. You have confidants. You have people, that care about you, but you don't feel connected much in a broader sense. Like you feel like you're that square wheel. You're out of place at work, or you don't feel like you fit in your parish or some other group. So this sense of social isolation. There's also one called the perceived emotional isolation. This is where, maybe you are a part of a good athletic team or a thriving parish, but you don't have those one-on-one confidence. You're kind of having this sense of emotional isolation, that inner dimension of loneliness. Okay, with that kind of background, I want to answer your question. In the year, I believe it was 2000, a book came out in the United States called Bowling Alone. And the author, I think Putnam, he looked at the research showing that first element of our social connectedness, how it had deteriorated primarily in the United States during the second half of the 20th century. People no longer belonged to groups to the extent that they used to, all kinds of different groups, political groups, athletic, bridge clubs, playing cards, whatever. And he called that book Bowling Alone, just because he found, for example, that participation in bowling leagues had declined compared to people just going out individually. And I know he had an interesting anecdote in there. He described, he went and actually visited a bowling alley. He said, even people within leagues, often now, when they would go back to their chairs between their turns, they were not socialized and they were looking at television screens. So sometimes even when social gatherings, we see this now in our sports bars and everything, even in social arrangements, we're distracted by televisions. And he did a lot of, detailed analysis looking at all kinds of different factors, like we're more mobile, we have families that move across the country or to a different country and all that. But at that time, he actually found the biggest influence, the correlation was actually television viewing. And again, not to say all television viewing is bad, but they found that when people watched it excessively, they were less likely to interact with other people face to face in groups. And even within households, the more televisions there were, the less likely you were to have time spent in interaction with those family members. So anyway, the year 2000, the technology of television seemed to have been having a big impact on that social dimension of loneliness. He writes that book around the year 2000. He said that there's kind of a new thing out there now that we have to wait and see what impact this is going to have. And of course, that was the internet. So we are there now. We've been there, 20 years, over 20 years. So now, we have, how is that going on today? There's the paradox. I like to think of it as a very sharp two-edged sword. We can connect with people. We can connect now with social media with maybe people we haven't seen since childhood, and we can connect with people and live in different continents. So it's a very, very wonderful thing, but we just have to be careful that that benefit doesn't reduce our face-to-face interaction with people. So we're sitting here on the computer, for long amounts of time while maybe our wife and kids are in another room thinking, well, where's dad? What's he so busy with? I'd kind of like him to interact with us. So I'd say yes. I mean, the different kinds of technologies have certainly had an impact, both good and bad, on our perceived sense of loneliness.
Hmm. I think I can start to see certain themes cutting across your work here, in the sense that within the Stoics you have certain formation of good habits, whereas if we do get into the habit of just sitting down with the television for hours at a time and not developing our skills in the art of conversation, then it's no wonder almost that we become what we practice, sort of thing. Does that make sense?
Oh, it sure does. In fact, actually, a few years ago, I have to credit my wife for this. She actually got me a little egg timer. So in times when I'm supposed to be getting busy and get down to work, I can say, okay, here's 10 minutes for social media, and then ding, okay, now do something else.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think that we set times for the internet for children, but we don't set them for ourselves.
Yes.
It's interesting.
No, you're
But
so right there.
so what do you think about the crisis around COVID-19 then? Is there any pluses that might come from this around this problem of loneliness, do you think?
Yeah, I hope so. Now, my heart really goes out now, maybe for older people, maybe they're not going to die of COVID, they're going to die of natural causes or other diseases they have. And they're very impacted in how much contact now they can have with the people that they love, or even their own priest or minister, or rabbi. So a very sad effect there that it could be impacting more social isolation right now. But I certainly hope positive will come in that we become more aware of the importance of this social interaction. So maybe when this is all over, we'll be more likely, to safely try to interact with others, to think more about those elderly people who've become the focus of our attention now because they're so much more susceptible to death. Hopefully we'll have a greater respect and dignity for them. Hopefully, we're going to use social media to do what we can now, increase our contact in the way that we can make contact. So maybe that will be a very good, positive blessing that's come from having the social media now to do our, face-to-face or our texts and so on. But yeah, so I hope from this adversity, it will make absence will make the heart grow fonder. And we will come to miss the simple goodness of a handshake or a hand on someone's shoulder or something. And hopefully, the time will come again when we can do that, and we will all value each other's one-on-one interaction more than ever.
Thank you, Kevin. So a central element of your work then, you kind of hinted at it there in a way, remembering those people that we've forgotten almost, is the focus on memory. I was wondering what sparked your own interest in memory, and why is it of such central importance?
Sure. Sometimes I give talks on memory because I've written several books about application of memory methods. And I usually start my talks, or at least early on, I say, it was the best quarter I ever spent. And here's what I mean by that. And again, I was a big reader. So I go to our annual book sale here in Springfield, Illinois. It's where Abraham Lincoln lived. So everything's named after Lincoln. So it was the Lincoln Library book sale. And I picked up this book called Your Memory, Speedway to Success in Earning, Learning, and Living by O.W. Bill Hayes. It was written in 1958. By the time I got a hold of it, maybe 1978, people didn't read it anymore. So the library discarded it. It was just a simple little book on memory techniques. It did not give their history. It just said how you can use these yourself. And I found it extremely helpful for me. It kind of transformed my ability to memorize things. I was still, in college at this time. So anything I needed to remember, boom, I used these methods. It was a piece of cake. I even used it by the time I took my psychology licensing exam years later and set my school's record, got the highest score in the state at the time. So anyway, I found these little techniques, found them so useful that by the time I was pursuing my master's degree in psychology, I wrote my thesis on them. The research that showed what happens when you apply these special methods, primarily it was a focus on adolescents, to teens, to school children, to learn geography facts or facts of biology and a variety of things. And most of that research showed that these are very, very powerful. Then years later, when I was able to do my doctoral work, that was in an Alzheimer's center. So we were looking at people who were losing their memory capacity. So this tied in. I also had the chance of actually applying some of these memory techniques to people with certain kinds of brain damage. Like a particular man who'd had tissue removed that made his verbal language-based retention for for information and words almost nothing, while his visual capacities on his intact brain center were very, very good, very strong. And we used these visual imagery memory techniques, and it almost normalized his memory capacity by doing that. So I've long had a very important interest in these memory techniques. I researched them for years. I've written books about them, and probably right now my own main personal use is when I go out and give public talks. I never have to use any notes. Now, I don't memorize my talks word for word, but with these methods, I lay out my key points, and there might be 40, 45 key points I want to make, and I can lay them out and know them in such an exact order that I could literally give the talk backwards if for some reason I wanted to, from my last point to my first. So just for me, the memory methods have proven very, very helpful to me, and I found that they're helpful for other people.
Yeah, I have also benefited from your work with memory, and the focus on location and having those visual images helped me remember. And the one talk that you gave about the 10 Commandments used in a room helped me remember the 10 Commandments, and that's a great way to have young children and things like that. I know my work as a primary school teacher, a lot of them could do with remembering these central tenets of our faith. And I think that speaks to something in your work, that memory is more than mere cognitive and something that's more than literally trivial almost, that it focuses us and allows us to flourish as human beings. You've spoken to the role of the body in memory a little bit there. If there's anything you'd like to add, could you do that? And in a time of Google where everything is remembered for us, I was just wondering, why is human memory so vital?
Yes, good question. One thing I do try to get across is, we're sometimes memories like pitted against the deeper levels of understanding. Like you can just have one or the other, or memory is like, just parroting things back. Well, that's not the main goal here. Even like the ancient Greeks and Romans distinguished between what they called memory for words versus memory for things. Words would be the ability to repeat verbatim a passage word for word. Things would be the ability to focus more on key concepts or ideas, but then to express them in your own words. Now, these techniques will work for both, but that's been my main emphasis, focusing on key things or ideas. And sometimes we get the idea that today, it's not so important to remember things because, look, this thing I'm holding in my hand, I can ask it a question, it'll tell me anything, right? Or look it up on the internet, you get to all the answers. But one example I like to give sometimes it's very important, though, to have that memory not in some device, but in your own head and even in your own body, even in your own fingertips. And here's one example. Say, imagine you had to have a major surgery. Who would you rather have perform this surgery on you? The world's greatest IT expert, surrounded by a room full of supercomputers. So anything comes up, he has virtually all the historical knowledge, all the practical knowledge of medicine at his fingertips in an instant. You can have him operate on you, or you can have the run-of-the-mill average Joe surgeon down at your local hospital who would have access to a fraction of the information. Well, I personally, in that case, would go with the surgeon because he could not access so much information so readily, but he would already have that information in his head and literally in his fingertips. If he was a surgeon, he would actually perform the manipulations. Of course, if we went the other way around, if my computer crashed, I would instantly go to the IT guy, But it just shows there's certain things that they're still worth knowing inside and out. And that would apply to things like tenets of our faith. In fact, people like St. Albert and St. Thomas said that memory is an important aspect of the virtue of practical wisdom or prudence. They said because to achieve goals in the future, we act in the present, guided by the lessons we've learned in the past. And it's our memories that hold those lessons.
Mm-hmm. So on the dark side of this, I believe that so much is remembered in a way on Twitter, for example, but there's no sense of forgiveness, which is obviously central to the Christian faith. I was wondering, how might we reconcile memory with forgiveness, and why is this important?
Now, that is a very interesting and a very profound question, Marcus. I've not been asked that, and I really like that. Here's one thing. I'm going to tie back to our discussion of loneliness. The researchers found that when people tend to be lonely for a long, long time, they find it harder to reach out to other people because their memories become selective. They remember times when they've been maybe rejected by others or treated harshly. They become less and less more unforgiving and less likely to reach out to others. And this can apply to us in so many ways. When we have these social media things, and maybe on the spur of the moment we jot some little comment, and maybe a friend of a long time sees that and said, "Oh, I didn't realize what a jerk that person was." Okay, defriend him or write a rebuttal. Sling words back and forth. So I think you need to watch for that when we are hesitant to forgive someone. Look what he did to me. Oh, he's my own brother, or a good friend. Look what they did to me. We tend to remember that. We need to always say, what am I forgetting? There's that one thing I didn't like. What about those 1,000 kind things that person has done for me? Epictetus had a little saying about this. He kind of simplified it, but he said everything has two handles. He said if your brother insults you, you can grab that incident by the handle that I've been insulted, or by the handle that, hey, this is my brother, and I owe him things and he's done me good things. So anyway, I think it's a very important thing to keep in mind in terms of the powers of our memory. If we're unforgiving, let's look and search our memories and see what we're leaving out of that picture and why we actually should forgive that person for their own sake and for ours.
Amazing. So I think this holds for the individual and for the collective, as it were, and how communities remember. So as someone from Northern Ireland, for example, there's a lot of dark memories for people and resentfulness based on former conflicts. I was wondering, could you explain maybe why communal memories centered around forgiveness like that are also so important?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Those communal memories that when we're divided in certain areas can remind us how we are united in more important areas. I think sometimes when I see different political conflicts or race conflicts, it's kind of like, we can look at human beings in at least 3 different levels. And one we kind of look at in terms of what's sometimes called identity politics now. Or a person okay, you're a member of a particular political party. You're a member of a particular nation, or political stance. And that's how I'm going to view you, overlooking the narrow dimension that we're all individuals. And people within the same political party, within the same nation, can be very, very different from one another. So we need to remember that we're all still individual people. We shouldn't put someone under the umbrella just of one label like that based on race or political belief or nation. But also ignores that most broad level of the common humanity of mankind, that we're all made in God's image and likeness. We all have intellects and wills. There's a great deal that we all hold in common. And because of that, we should be able to work through and resolve these differences in a humane and helpful way. I think of the way these common memories, you see them, one, through the history of the church. And here even now, like with the word Northern Ireland, we have, of course, with groups of Protestants and groups of Catholics, those historical differences there and other places throughout the centuries. But look at that commonality that we share, in the Bible. We have the same, books of the New Testament there. We have that common heritage. We can all, appeal to the same history, the same fundamental concepts. And even in my reading the ancient Greeks and Romans, they didn't have the Bible, but sources like Homer served that purpose for them. It was the thing all those people knew, even though the Roman Empire was divided into many nations. They drew from the Greeks. It's something they held in common, and they would pluck little moral lessons from Homer. I mean, things I might just read over without thinking about it. They pluck that little sentences. Yeah, this is where we're told we must show people hospitality, or whatever the virtue is. So anyway, maybe I've gotten off track there, but I do think, yes, we do need to bear in mind those communal memories and how it can unite us.
Thank you very much, Kevin. So one of your books that is one of my favorites, you might see it just over my left shoulder in the video, I'm not sure, but it's Fit for Eternal Life. And I think you bring together so many of these interesting themes and put the body and the mind back together where they belong. So we've spoken about the role of the body and memory and things like that. I was just wondering, why is the body so central to the Christian life, and why did you feel the need to write this book?
Sure. Now, this is an interesting book. It's my second Catholic book, and it was like a combination between a book that was my idea and someone asked me to write. Because I was well aware that, the Greeks and Romans, we have this long tradition of a healthy mind and a healthy body. They knew how the two go together. And the editor of my first book, Memorize the Faith on Memory, knew I had this background in weightlifting and powerlifting and so on. And he asked me if I'd be interested in writing a book on the Christian, and on the Catholic specifically approach to the care of the body. I'm like, yes, I'd love to. But my first thought then was, well, what exactly is that? So I had to go out and do a lot of research. And I found some of our modern popes had written explicitly about this topic. They talked to groups of athletes. They said how it is important to care for our body. One of the popes, Pius XII, talked about physical culture, the proper care of the body. He said the church is all for it. He says, if you keep it in proper proportion. And then he said what that meant, so you don't become obsessed by it. So it doesn't keep you away from your other duties, so you're not working out so many hours a day, you ignore your kids, or you leave early from work, things like this. And of course, the scriptures itself, which all Christians have in common, we're taught that the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. The whole incarnation, Christ, became man. Even in the book of Genesis, it says time and time again, God said what he created was good. We have some of these Gnostic ideas that the spirit is good and the physical world is evil. Well, Christianity does not teach that. Christ did not teach that. He took a body. We're taught that we're going to have glorified bodies after the last judgment because God made us as unified beings of body and soul. Now, people like Thomas Aquinas would talk about angels as being purely spiritual, not possessing physical bodies like we do. But humans are the only beings on earth that do have a spiritual, immaterial, immortal soul, but it's combined. We're in union with our physical bodies, so our physical bodies are important. We are to tend them, to use them to show God, honor and dignity. We're to try to keep them healthy and strong, for our own sakes, so we can better serve others. So yeah, I think integral to Christian teaching is that we definitely respect our bodies.
Excellent. So how have we misinterpreted Christ by downgrading the body? Then you spoke of the Gnostics there and things like that, which downgrade the body. But also, I believe you speak about certain of our iconography, which depicts Christ in a more weak state, and whereas you phrase it that he would have been very physically fit and so on. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, and I see that. We often see the iconography of Christ as being very, very frail, very, emaciated and fragile looking, or very, very mild and meek. And I see the reason for some of that. It's kind of like, here's the almighty, all-powerful God of the universe who has allowed himself to become a human, to suffer through the hands of other human beings. I see that, I see the reasoning there. But also, if we just think about the life of Christ himself at the time that he lived, with his father there as a carpenter, him very likely helping his father. We know through the Gospels during Christ's social ministry, he traveled great distances on foot. He's going up and down mountains. Also, since Christ was without sin, he would have not have known physical sloth or laziness like we do, or at least he would not have given into it. He would have not have known gluttony. So certainly he also took care of his body by eating the proper way, except for purposeful times of fasting and so on. So very likely, Christ himself was quite the rugged individual, and essentially too, you would have to be able to endure what he did in his passion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that, Kevin. So for us then in the modern day, how should we get that proper Christian balance between mind, body, and soul? Do you have any practical tips? I know you do a lot of daily exercises yourself and keep in good shape all around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in general, I think that subtitle of my book, Fit for Eternal Life, was about a Christian approach to working out, eating right, and building the virtues of fitness in your soul. So just a couple key themes. One is the relationship between physical exercise and virtue. For example, fortitude comes from the word strength. It means one aspect is the ability to do hard things, which comes in things like strength training. It's hard to lift progressively heavier weights over time. Thomas Aquinas says there's also an enduring capacity to fortitude, to bear and forbear, to carry on. So we can even apply it to things like endurance training. If you're running or walking or biking or swimming or doing things that are moderately difficult for a long time, it actually can call forth that virtue of fortitude and help us apply it in other areas. The same thing with temperance or self-control in the way we eat. We can train ourselves to rein our desires in so we're not harming ourselves. But in terms of practical suggestions, another part of the reason is I tend to write most about a method for strength training, and there's also a parallel method for aerobic training. But the strength training version is called high intensity training. And it's basically just where you work out very intensely, but safely, but briefly. Like once you warm up, and this is the way I've been doing it for decades, you may do two, but more often than even one hard set of an exercise. Then you're done with that exercise. You rest, you may not do it again for another week. So I try to say there are ways you can train your body without having to work out hours a day. Now, I've been retired for a few years, so I do something now almost every day, but that's because it now fits in with my schedule. There were years when I was busy where I did my strength training as little as once a week. So my main message there is for people, no matter how busy or how much leisure you have, you can find ways, taking into consideration your own age, your own circumstances, your own interest and what you enjoy in terms of physical activities, but there are ways that you can do that without becoming obsessed and without having to neglect your more important duties to God and your neighbor.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin. So I have another book that you have written close to my own heart in some ways, is about Ireland and some Irish saints, 3 Irish saints, and but you've also been involved in different pilgrimages to Ireland. I'd love to speak to you about that. Can you explain what draws you to this great ancient nation of ours, and why do you take pilgrimages there?
Sure, I know it's partly in my genes. My mother's family were Leahys from the County Kerry region of Munster, and her mother was a Newell, who we've been told came from Northern Ireland. My son has done some research, and we know like a great-great-grandfather on my father's side had married a good Dublin girl. So there's a lot of, we have a lot of Irish in our genes in my family. But also, I just love the tradition. I love, before I'd ever gone there, I love the music. I love the sense of humor. I love the beauty of the land, from what I'd seen in pictures at that point. I love it. It's the land of the saints and scholars. So just so much drew me to Ireland that at some point I wanted to do a book. And my name, Kevin, had an interesting finding there when I started to research St. Kevin. Now, one thing, I knew nothing of the ancient Irish or Gaelic language. And I knew the story of St. Kevin, the famous one where he's holding the blackbird in his hand because it lays its eggs in his hand while he's praying, and he holds his hand there until the birds can fly away and so forth. But I kept trying to track him down, and I couldn't until I started reading this life of what to me looked like Comgen or something. Comgen was one of the spellings. And I thought, oh, no, that is Kevin. There is St. Kevin. So anyway, my mom had 5 or 6 miscarriages before I was born. That's why I have the middle name of Gerard. Gerard of Magella, a patron of childbirth, right? Well, when I'm doing this research on St. Kevin, I see that they say in some of the ancient Irish lives that one of the meanings of the name is fair or gentle birth. I thought, wow, both of my names have to do with childbirth, and I don't think my mom even realized that. She never told me that, and I doubt she even knows. So my heart really went out to him. But anyway, so I think it's 2011, I think, or 12. I wrote a book for 10 books called 3 Irish Saints. The main 3 saints I focused on were Kevin, Patrick, and Bridget. At the end of each chapter, I had like a little 1-page summary of some others because I just couldn't restrain myself. There were so many wonderful saints, Brendan and the Navigator and so many others. But anyway, here's a central theme I used for that book. In the Catholic history, through Thomas Aquinas and others, they often distinguish between what they call the contemplative life and the active life. The contemplatives are specifically drawn, to prayer and contemplation. The active life, people specifically drawn to getting out there in the world and evangelizing, and so on. So I kind of thought in my head, well, if I want to really boil this down in modern language, at the risk of oversimplifying, I said, we call these like the thinkers and the doers. The contemplatives are the thinkers, and the active folks are the doers. But then I also read this wonderful book by a French psychologist from 100 years ago or so, Henry Joly, French psychologist, wrote a book called The Psychology of the Saints. And he talked about what he saw as 2 classes of saints. He said one class tend to be the zealous, eager propagandizers. And he didn't mean propaganda in a bad way. He meant these are the folks with the burning zeal to get out there and spread that gospel. He said another class is known for their loving tenderness, okay? And among the first examples he gives are that zealous person, St. Dominic, the founder of the Dominican order that had that great zeal to carry that torch, of the gospel throughout the world. And then his example for the lovers was Dominic's friend and contemporary, St. Francis, so known for his one-on-one acts. So I thought, anyway, so when I write Three Irish Saints, I'm going to talk about thinkers, doers, and lovers. The thinkers will be the contemplatives, and my person I use there as the model was St. Kevin, because he's a hermit out there in that beautiful Glendalough, valley for 7 years before he became abbot of a little monastery. He's going to be my thinker. Who better a doer, an active person than St. Patrick, the man who traveled all throughout Ireland, converting the whole nation. Kind of like, I call the doers like the grand scale movers and shakers of the Christian world. So there was Patrick for sure. And then for lovers, so I broke those active into doers and lovers. And lovers were the ones who were doing things, but known most foremost for their one-on-one acts of wonderful hospitality and kindness. And I thought, Bridget takes the cake there, St. Bridget, for all of her acts of mercy towards the beggars, much to her father's chagrin, to her acts of mercy towards animals too. So anyway, that kind of became the theme of that book, the Three Irish Saints, focusing on Kevin, Patrick, and Bridget. I even kind of had a little, not a scientific thing, but a little scale I put in there to kind of measure yourself. Which one is most like you? So you can measure yourself on all three dimensions with different questions. Are you more like a Kevin or a Patrick or a Bridget? And again, not implying that we all need to do all three, right?
Yeah.
Some of us tend to have more strength in one area or another and might be able to identify a little more strongly with that particular kind of saint.
Marvelous. Thank you, Kevin. So just to take it back to another book and to your reconversion, as it were, you've written about moving from atheism to Catholicism. So you said you were an atheist for a long time, for many years. I'm just wondering, can you tell us briefly about your reconversion and how philosophy and science pointed you towards Christ particularly? What kind of role philosophical arguments played?
Sure. I'll start with just a brief description of the layout and idea behind that book, From Atheism to Catholicism, which I wrote, I think, when I'd been back in the faith about 5 years or so, in my late 40s. St. Pope John Paul II, I loved his encyclical, Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, because he has a sentence in there too, a statement where he says that, basically, even in the writings of people who tried to rend faith and reason further apart, he said there might be germs of truth in there that can help lead us to the truth. These people, even some of these prominent atheists, they may be flat out wrong about God, but there may be certain statements they say where they're glimpsing some truth. So we can look at those and analyze those. So that kind of became the focus of this book. The first part of the book, I talk about some of the key atheists who influenced me while I was an atheist. People like Ayn Rand, the Russian and American novelist and philosopher, Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, the ones who mainly influenced me at the time that I was an atheist. An American psychologist, Albert Ellis, is another one that I wrote about there, who had a strong impact on me with his rationally motive behavior therapy or cognitive therapy. So basically, in those chapters, I try to say what draws people to these atheists. I mean, there's obviously something appealing there. So for each of those people, I kind of tried to explain what the appeal was to me, maybe where some of their ideas that have nothing to do with atheism, I still consider good ideas, and I still find helpful in some ways. Well, second part of the book, I talk kind of about transitional figures. People started moving me in the other direction. And a couple examples here, there's 4 or 5. But one was those Stoics again, okay? Because I respected them, while I was an atheist, and they sought virtue and truth, and some of them did indeed seem to believe in a personal God. So Albert Ellis, the cognitive therapist, he said that his system was based largely on the Stoics, but he was a very powerful atheist. But I realized the Stoics themselves were not. Now, Ayn Rand said her philosophy was largely an outgrowth of Aristotle's. Okay, she was a militant atheist. Aristotle was not. He wrote arguments, about the prime mover, how reason can lead us to God, which St. Thomas Aquinas would later build upon. So those figures, though, I wrote about how they impacted me for bad and for good. But then in my early 40s, I read St. Thomas Aquinas for the first time through a series of events. And I realized the main arguments that I read from the atheists, thought Thomas had answered those powerfully. 700 years ago, or almost 800 years ago now, I didn't even know it. He's borrowing from people who lived long before him, like Aristotle, St. Augustine, and others. So it was primarily through St. Thomas Aquinas that I was able to reject these atheistic ideas and open up my mind to other great Christian thinkers. And I did little chapters on, like, C.S. Lewis had an impact on me, G.K. Chesterton, Pope John Paul II himself. But to really cut to the chase here, I'll just briefly tell you, here were two of the main arguments that drew me away from God that Thomas answered. One, and this is still out there today in super popular books on atheism, like Dawkins' book, The Godless Delusion. They'll say the idea of God itself is self-contradictory. How can God be all-powerful and all-knowing? Because if he knows what he's going to do tomorrow, then he doesn't have the power to do anything different, does he? Now, like, that's in there, but Thomas addresses that kind of thing in the Summa Theologica. He said that would apply if you take your conception of God as a great big human being, but he's not. He said, reason leads us to understand that God is eternal. He lives in an eternal now. He doesn't have a yesterday, today, and tomorrow like you and I do. He's completely actualized all the time, so that conflict is not there. And he gives a nice little analogy here. He says, imagine you're traveling to some town, and it's on a hilly path, a hilly road. So, you may not see that town until you reach the top of the last hill. And you don't know who's before you on the road, way ahead of you, or who's behind you because of those hills blocking your way. He said, but imagine the perspective of a person high in the air. They see the whole town all the time. They see everyone traveling the road. And he said, so in a sense, that illustrates God's eternal perspective. So I was kind of wowed by that. And the other major argument was just the idea that God's not necessary. Like Ayn Rand said this, her fundamental premise was existence exists. Open up your eyes, there's the universe. You don't need to ask where it came from. That's the starting point. Or Bertrand Russell said when he was 12 or 14 or something, he heard someone say, well, they say God made the universe. Well, who made God? So it's a related argument. Well, God's not necessary. Just the universe is just there. And here again, I saw that Thomas had answered this for me, primarily in his third argument of contingency about God in the Summa. That, think about it. None of us gave ourselves our own existence. Nothing in the universe gave itself its own existence. The nature of physical matter itself is not to know and understand and remember. So for all these things, in the universe as a whole, there has to be something underlying it that is necessary, that's not contingent, that doesn't just may exist, but must exist and give rise to all other forms of existence. And Thomas summarizes this, in his third argument, third proof there early in the Summa. He embellishes it later in the Summa, in his Summa Contra Gentiles. There's a lot that can be said about it. But also, kind of amazingly, even in the Summa there, this is summarized by these ancient desert people, the wandering Jews. Moses asks God his name, and God says to him, Yahweh, or basically, I am who am. He says, who should I say sent me? Say, he who is sent you. Then he later reveals, he's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But here we have this philosophical chain saying that God is the only being that must exist, and is the fount of all existence. And here you have it summarized in two words in the Old Testament, I am. So it's, kind of mind-blowing stuff. But in that book, I kind of lay out these arguments where there may still be some good, wheat there in the ideas of some of these atheists that might prove helpful, but how they were wrong on the fundamental idea of the existence of God, which I myself was wrong about for 25 years, until, thank God, I found St. Thomas Aquinas.
Mm-hmm. So for those people who maybe aren't as drawn to more philosophical questions in what Charles Taylor calls our secular age, how do we make these questions live for people that it animates and motivates them in their daily lives? I know people like Bishop Barron do it for a lot of people that I've come across. Do you have any particular advice in that respect?
Yes, because I know, I tend to be what my father-in-law used to call a noodle, or an egghead, a person who lives in the world of books and ideas. And not everybody's that way. When I've given talks, I've seen people like professors say, hey, same thing happened to me. Thomas Aquinas, drew me back. But that's not necessarily the typical path. There's many reasons. that people reject God for emotional reasons, because they've been hurt, because they've seen suffering. There's a variety of reasons out there. So yes, there's different approaches we must use. Bishop Barron, does a wonderful job there with some of these approaches. My own approach has probably been this one, because it also appealed to me early on. Thomas Aquinas is extremely practical also in the things that absolutely matter the most to every single human being, because he argues we all want to be happy. That's why some people think it's going to come through possessions or through some high office or job and so forth. We all want happiness. And Thomas says we're right to seek a limited natural happiness here on earth, but an ultimate eternal happiness in heaven. So he writes extensively in the second part of the Summa Theologica primarily about what it means to be a human being, to be given by God the gift of having an intellect and a will. How can we learn to control our emotions? How can we learn to build our virtues so we're going to be happier people here on earth? So I think that also is one of the things that really drew me to Thomas early on too. Being a psychologist, I thought, wow, Thomas is a better psychologist than Sigmund Freud or any of the, Alfred Adler, the namesake of my school, any of the people I've been trained in. So there's a great deal of practical wisdom in there in St. Thomas Aquinas, and not, of course, not only in him. Part of the reason he's so helpful is that he absorbed so much the great Christian teachers before him, and of course there have been great Christian teachers after him. So I'd say one of the appeals that might open people's hearts to the existence of God is if we can just share this virtue with them, share this happiness with them, to show that, that God intends us to lead fulfilled lives and maybe spark their curiosity.
Marvelous. So you've written a number of books about Thomas Aquinas now. He seems to be a constant source of inspiration, and I think you've expressed well there how he deals with those perennial live questions and how he applies across the board. Another facet that you've built upon via Aquinas and the likes of Aristotle is on friendship, which is an interesting one. I was just wondering, why is true friendship so important? And can you tell us what they had to say about that?
Sure. Yeah. In 2016, I wrote a book called The Four Friendships. And unfortunately, it's probably been one of my least selling books, but it was a joy to put together. Of course, the title was a play on C.S. Lewis's famous book, The Four Loves. But in The Four Friendships, I am talking about four great writings on the nature of friendship. Two of these from pagan philosophers and two from Christian theologians. And let's start with the first pairing. The profound writing on friendship is found in Aristotle, his Nicomachean Ethics. I think his books 8 and 9 talks all about friendship, looks at it from every angle. And probably two of the highlights are, he talks about 3 classes or kinds of friendship, because I think we can all relate to this. He says there are friendships that are based on utility or use. We're helpful for each other. You're going through a graduate program, so you form a study group with people. You each help each other, learn the lessons, keep track of things, motivate each other. Or maybe in a gym, you're part of a powerlifting team. You do that. You're useful and helpful to each other. And that's one aspect of friendship. We can help each other. So other friendships are based on pleasure. We find each other amusing. It's just we go out and have a good time. And that's fine. There's friendships that can be based on pleasure. He said, but all this is to friendship, though. He says, what if that person who's useful to you is no longer useful? You're going to let them go. Or you no longer find them amusing, you get tired of them. Well, there goes that, what seemed to be a friendship. But he talks about the highest and truest form of friendship based on virtue. You value, the higher things in each other. You care about each other as people. And this is built upon what Aristotle called treating the other person as a second self. And he said, true friendship is based on the natural love we have for ourselves. We want to survive. We have survival instinct. We want to be happy. And when we form a true friendship with another person, we also transfer that to them. So the same way we want to stay alive, boy, we want that person to stay alive. The same way we have good feelings about ourselves, we want that for the other person. The same way that we try to get good things for ourselves, we're going to try to get good things, for our friend. The same way that we do obtain pleasure when good things come our way, well, now we obtain pleasure when good things come to our friend too. There's all kind of dignified writing about friendship there in Aristotle that can kind of help us, look at our own friendships, Are we helping each other grow in virtue? Are we loving that person for their own sake or just for what they can do for us? Now, let's see how many centuries later, like 16 centuries later or so, Thomas learns Aristotle's theory of friendship backwards and forwards. In fact, he writes a commentary on the Nicomachean Ethic, every line of it, so he knows it well. And then when Thomas starts writing about the theological virtue of charity in his Summa Theologica, he starts it by saying that charity is friendship with God. And he builds on all these ideas of Aristotle, how the natural base is our self-love, how virtuous friendship outstrips the pleasureful and utilitarian friendship. But there's a crucial difference. In an interesting line in Aristotle, he said, well, you want what's best for your friend. He said, would you want your friend to become a god? And remember, these are the ages of ancient Greece, where people like Hercules, or there'd be demigods, and theoretically that was possible. So the greatest good that you could have would be to become a god, be raised up to Olympus, He said, would you want that for your friend? And Aristotle said, no, you wouldn't actually, because you treat your friend like another self, and yourself and a god are two different things. You couldn't be friends with a god. But then Thomas turns it on its head 16 centuries later, because he tells us, Christ, he said, when he came down to earth, I came here no longer to call you servants, but to call you friends. So Thomas says God himself became a man and actually called mankind to his friendship. So, what Thomas did with Aristotle, I think, is astounding. He kept all the good and noble elements of Aristotle and took it to an unforeseen level because of the person of Christ. Now, an interesting story is virtually the same thing happened with two other people. Marcus Tullius Cicero, the 1st century BC in Rome, wrote a wonderful treatise, sometimes called the Laelius, a dialogue on friendship. This nobleman's best friend has died, and his sons-in-law ask him to tell him about his friend and tell him about his friendship. And he gives this wonderful discourse on the nature of friendship. And he kind of focuses in on, he knew Aristotle's writing. He doesn't cite him, but he was trained by people who knew Aristotle. So there's a lot of overlap. He really focuses there mostly on the harmony between friends. You kind of seek for the same things, that other self idea again. Okay, so it's really beautiful writing. Many centuries later, in the 12th century, a Cistercian abbot, St. Aelred of Rievaulx. In his youth, he was a steward to King David of Scotland. He came from a family that had connections, but he said he lived kind of an unrestrained, frivolous life. He said at one point he read Cicero's book on friendship. He said it wowed him. He realized how he's cultivating so many false friendships, and he wanted to develop virtuous friendships. Well, a few years later, he becomes a monk, and then later an abbot, and he says, it occurred to me how much I got out of Cicero's book on friendship, he said. So I've gone back to it, he says. But it's not the same to me now, he said, because it doesn't have the salt of the scriptures or the sweet honey of Jesus Christ, he said. So he's going to write a book on friendship that actually does incorporate about 40% of Cicero's book. But he's going to tell us about spiritual friendship, friendships based in Christ. So again, he wrote this wonderful book that did the same thing Aquinas did to Aristotle. He incorporates and uses the noble elements of the pagan philosopher and just ratchets it up to a whole new level. So I personally just thought the story itself was fascinating. Oh, also, St. Thomas came after Aelred. St. Thomas' knowledge is virtually encyclopedic, but it does not appear he knew of Aelred's writings. His book, The Spiritual Friendship, another wonderful book called The Mirror of Charity, because Aelred's books appear to be limited to just a few Cistercian monasteries in the centuries after his death. So I was thinking, man, wouldn't it have been awesome if Aquinas also knew Aelred's work? And he certainly would have incorporated some of that as well. But anyway, I just love the story of it, and I love the fact that also it's so practical, because we can read what all four of these men say and say, hey, what kind of a friend am I? Am I doing what they recommend, or am I doing what they don't?
Magnificent. I think your book actually does point us the way to deeper friendship in a kind of throwaway culture. Often we don't get beyond those base levels of friendship, unfortunately. So with your background in psychology then, and now that you've come to know Aquinas and the tradition so well, I think you can navigate those two for many of us who are interested in both. You've written The 7 Deadly Sins, which sort of moves from psychology to theology more outright. People will have heard of these and probably not have taken them with the due seriousness. What are some of these sins, and why should we be worried about them, and why should we take them seriously?
Sure. To give a quick rundown, they're usually listed as either pride or vainglory in some lists. Avarice, envy, wrath, lust, avidity, gluttony, and sloth, or acedia. And they are important for several reasons. One is they're often misinterpreted. Like we hear the word sloth, or I think in English world they may pronounce it sloth, And we often tend to think of it in terms of laziness. Oh, wow, that's a deadly sin. I'm just sitting here on the couch eating potato chips. I should be out doing something else. I should be mowing the lawn. Is that a deadly sin? Well, no, that one really, it comes from the Greek acedia, which means without care. It's spiritual sloth. It means that you don't care about the things of God. You might be very physically active, but while you're physically active, you're ignoring the things that God would bid you do, worship him, take proper care of your family, your friends, and so on. So for a lot of these, we have like a surface understanding of what they really imply. Oh, and so Thomas says that sloth or acedia is really an affront to the great commandment to love God with all we are, because it kind of says, God, I don't care. Another is envy. And Thomas distinguishes it from jealousy. Jealousy would be your fear to lose something you have, like you're jealous someone's going to take your wife or your job or something. But envy, he's saying, mainly is that when we are saddened when a good comes to some other person. You might not even want that good yourself, but you're sad because this other person got honored in some way. Shoot, well, what about me? What does it say about me? So he says, in some ways, that is opposed to the second great commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself, because we want good things to come to ourselves. So we should want good things to come to our neighbor too. So envy, has that element of opposing that second great commandment. I'll say two other important elements here. Thomas, in addressing these sins, borrows from a great tradition that comes before him. Western thinkers like Pope St. Gregory the Great, Eastern thinkers, St. John Climacus, and others. There's quite a tradition, interesting tradition about these sins, which I give in the first half of the book. But two things. One thing he talks about are the different varieties of these sins. Like for gluttony, you might think gluttony means I eat too much. Well, that can be one aspect of it. But he says primarily, though, it's an inordinate, improper desire for food, valuing it in ways that it shouldn't be valued, thinking about it too much. So you can't see if a person's gluttonous just by their body size. I'll tell you from my history in bodybuilding when I was younger, there's never been times when I've been more focused on food and what I'm going to eat next than when I was severely dieting for a bodybuilding contest, trying to get lean, right? He says also gluttony can be expressed in other ways. When you wolf down your food. Are you picky? You only want to eat gourmet foods. You're not going to eat this common stuff someone sets before you. So it's really more of your attitude. So we can look at different varieties of sin like this. He also has a concept of what they call the daughters of these sins, or what flows from these sins. And give you one example for envy. He said some of the main daughters include one would be gossip. You hear some friend, some person you work with has had some great honor, and that makes you feel envious. So you go talk to somebody else, say, yeah, they got that honor, but did you realize that their brother's related to the head of the company and he arranged it for him? To kind of try to downplay it that way, or say something negative about them in another regard. So what Thomas called tale bearing, T-A-L-E bearing, or gossip can reveal your envy. Another would be detraction. This is where to that person's face you might kind of play it down. You might, what do we call damning with faint praise? You might say, hey, I heard you got that promotion, but did you hear about so-and-so, this other person, this much greater thing happened to him, So that tendency, we might try to detract a person. He said, then if you do these things, if that other person, if now they're feeling sad, now they kind of worked, he said, then you're experiencing joy in another person's misfortune, which is obvious contrary to love. And he said, if it fails, then you're grieving over another's good fortune, even after your own efforts, So all these sins, Thomas lays out these so-called daughters and varieties. They're like more specific actions and behaviors. So we can look at those and just say, hey, am I envious? Yes or no? Have I done this? Have I done that? So they can really help us examine our consciences.
Excellent. Have you faced much resistance then from other psychologists or the man in the street in describing humans as sinners? And how do you bridge that gap between psychology and theology, especially now when some of the older terms, the distinct Christian terms, have fallen out of favor?
Yes, and now personally now, actually in the street, face-to-face, personally, I've usually not received that, but I know in the literature out there, we have these ideas. I remember that that British philosopher Bertrand Russell wrote a book called The Conquest of Happiness many decades ago. And he said that one of the things that make people unhappy is the very idea of sin. The idea that we could offend God. He said, that's why people are unhappy. They should give up this idea of sin itself. I thought kind of ironically, his next chapter was about envy. I said, well, we call envy one of the 7 deadly sins, And then later, I think it was in the 60s or 70s, a great American psychiatrist, Menninger, wrote a book about whatever happened to sin. And he was showing how we were suffering more trauma, mental trauma, depression, dissatisfaction, since we discarded the idea. So there's a lot out there, a lot of negativity towards religion. But there are some positives out there too. For example, this Albert Ellis, I said, who influenced me when I was younger because of his great work in cognitive therapy, rational love therapy. He used to say that religion encourages us in the irrational ideas that make us upset ourselves. That everybody must love me or I'm unhappy. I think he's right there. Many of us do think that. And he said Christianity and other religions encourage that, but I say no, they don't. Christ says that we're blessed when people persecute us. We're called to love other people, but there's no guarantee other people, let alone everybody's going to love us, right? But anyway, even Ellis himself, as the research accrued over the decades, that people with a strong religious sense were actually tended to have better mental health and be more stable. I know he himself was willing to write a book with a Christian author about applying these methods to Christians. So, kudos there. And I know also in recent decades, some secular psychologists, influential people like Martin Seligman, who is the president of the American Psychological Association, has started to write more and more about the opposite of vice or sin, which is virtue. Mm-hmm. So something that Christianity and the best of other religions and philosophies share is this concept of virtue. And we look at that from Thomistic lenses in terms of, he calls them perfections of our powers. God gives us all these wonderful gifts. If we develop virtues, we're going to use them to their fullest. So I think that's a nice integration between psychology and theology, when we also say that that's also what makes us happy. And even the Stoics, that's what they said too. You want a fulfilled and happy life, pursue virtue and follow God.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kevin. So one thing that interests me is the tendency now to psychologize our opponents, say politically, for example, by labeling them whatever it is, phobic, and suggesting that they have all these different biases. This is popular psychology, I guess, as if other people aren't free moral agents. Mm-hmm. Many of these things are, I think, hard to prove, and I would suspect a lot of times unfounded. Would you caution against this kind of pop psychology, and or am I missing something?
Yes, I'll give a few thoughts here. I mean, occasionally, I'll meet a person and they'll hear that I'm a psychologist, like, you're going to know all about me. Like, in my opinion, because I study psychology, I know that I don't know all about you, until I actually can be with you for a time and listen to you. And even then, it's going to be limited, right? And this is also, it happens to be another instance where I've actually reread within the last few weeks a little bit of Ayn Rand, that atheist philosopher, because thinking about your question, she actually wrote an article called The Psychology of Psychologizing, where she was arguing against that tendency to, if a person holds a statement contrary to ours, rather than dealing with the argument on its face and reasoning through it, we want to point to that person's motivation. Something's wrong with them. This is why they're saying that, right? Instead of what exactly do they say? Is it true or is it false? Or are there elements of truth and falsehood into it? So in a sense, it's an old variant of that old, logical fallacy of the ad hominem, arguing against the person instead of against their argument. And I think we have to be very, very careful of that today, because so often people with a contrary view, where we've got a label sitting there for them. Oh, you're a racist. Oh, you're a rigid traditionalist. Oh, you're a cafeteria Catholic. We have all these things ready to pull out, all these labels to use that does let us, I think, bypass the common search for truth and just try to attack the other person's motivation. And we may be all wrong. We may not know what's motivating that person. The important thing is, let's look at the actual topic we're discussing. And again, Marcus, I can't help but point out, this is another reason why I love St. Thomas Aquinas. If you go to his Summa Theologica, for every important issue, he starts with what he calls these objections. People who, based on rational arguments, maybe based on philosophical principles or based on passages of scripture, hold a view on a topic that's different from his. And he actually lays them out very clearly and succinctly. Some people have said better than the people who themselves held the opinions. And when he responds to them, he gives his own answer. He goes back one by one and looks at those and shows like maybe they were partly right here, or this is the sense in which that could be interpreted, but here's how they missed the boat. So anyway, to me, that's a great inspiration. We need to be careful to listen to each other and to be very, very careful about casting people aside by psychologizing or applying one-word catch-alls to their views.
Mm-hmm. Excellent advice. Thank you very much, Kevin. So in other works, you have focused on the Mass and the Latin Mass and the importance of ritual. I was wondering what, I think for me, it ties a lot of your themes in your work together. So the body and meaningful action, the central importance of memory, coming together as a community to remember the most important person in history. I was just wondering what speaks to you so profoundly about the liturgy, and how do you think it can help us today?
Yeah, great question, Marcus. I will say that I'm old enough that as a little kid, we had the Latin Mass before we switched to the Novus Order, the new. So I've known the new order, the most. At times, I had gone out of curiosity to Latin Masses here in town, but I was actually asked by readers to write a book called Memorize the Math, and by a second reader, a book called Memorize the Latin Mass, where I specifically zoomed in on the Latin Mass. Though I did also address it in that first book, Memorize the Mass. But anyway, Christ said, yeah, do this in remembrance of me. And I find that both of the orders of the Mass do that. They draw us together there to remember Christ. I happen to go to a church now that has an order of priests that offers the Latin Mass and the new Mass. In fact, the new Mass they do in English and in Spanish. I don't know how they can master so much. And I normally go to the Latin Mass, but I have gone to the new order Masses too. And it can be an absolutely beautiful thing when it is done with great reverence. So to me, I think that is one of the fundamentals of the Mass, of the liturgy, which means work for God, that we do try to make our focus on God himself, whichever order of the Mass that we're going to. That's where our focus is. Not that we make it so much centered on ourselves or centered on the personality of the priest. You definitely don't get that in the Latin Mass. The priest himself is even facing the other way most of the time. And to really make our focus on Christ, on that sacrifice, on his passion, how he gave himself to us, the great mystery of the Eucharist there, this opportunity for prayer. But again, I don't want to say too that, so the focus is more on God than on each other, but not to say that we aren't important either. Christ is in each one of us, and there are still things that we can do as a parish. If you have talents, particular talents in singing or playing a certain musical instrument or in recitation, then do that. Do them at the proper events. But I would hope that during the Mass, we really come there with a great sense of awe and reverence and thanksgiving with what God's presenting to us.
Beautiful. And do you think this then also helps protect us from what the philosopher James K. Smith calls like cultural liturgies, which train us in false worship, sort of ritual patterns which form our hearts or our longings for lesser goods? And are there maybe other goods of the liturgy that you think are essential that other people are missing out on, I guess?
Yeah, and that's a very important point. I think that's been one of it's not, I'm not going to say it's necessarily inherent in it, but one of the dangers, especially we saw with the new Mass, especially in decades past when there's all kinds of improvisations and changes where each Mass, you never know what you're going into when you went from one church to the next. So hopefully, one thing we talk about the universal Catholic Church. So ideally, the fundamentals of the liturgy are going to be the same wherever you go. With a Latin Mass, we did also have that common language. Now, not many people were fluent in Latin, but for a long, long time, we also had the English-Latin missals where you can follow along in your translation there. But again, it's always something we need to balance. When the church has moved into different countries, there are certain cases in which certain aspects of that culture were respected and brought in, as Patrick did when he came to Ireland and others. But hopefully, so there can, I guess, be, to a certain extent, be certain variance in the way our particular church looks, maybe certain particular aspects of how we worship, depending on where we are in our culture. But I would just hope that the central sense of reverence, the liturgy of the Mass itself, would be something that we all share in common, regardless of where or when we live, because it's this timeless gift of God.
Marvelous. So just to close up, if we may, I was wondering, do you want to speak about your future work, and what would you like your legacy to be then?
Sure, yeah, future work is sort of easy. I just finished a book for the first draft of a book for Sophia Institute Press, Aquinas on the Four Last Things, Death, Judgment, Heaven, and Hell. So that'll be the next one out. It mainly summarizes his work from the supplement at the very end of the Summa Theologica. That should be out in the fall. Books I want to write in the foreseeable future. For a long, long time, I wanted to do a memory book applied to Epictetus's handbook, the 53 little chapters there. So it would show you how to remember the key messages for each of his passages, because it's called a handbook. It's supposed to be ready at hand. And there's many, many times within it where Epictetus says, remember this, remember. So I want to give people an instrument that actually can help them do that. So they know these valuable lessons, backwards and forwards. Again, lessons that were so important that we know 3 Christianized adaptations existed for use in monasteries, okay? So that's what I'd like to do. Perhaps with the same publisher I did the Porch and the Cross, or maybe another. It's still early on, so we'll have to see about that. And another book I'd like to do, I've not broached any publishers yet though. I would love to do another book, Thomas Aquinas, on his writings on the attributes of God. Now, not necessarily at first on those 5 proofs. There's been a heck of a lot written there and wonderful stuff. But a book on what Thomas says, what can we know about God based on our reason alone? How can we know that he's simple or not composed of parts? How can we know that he's pure spirit? How can we know that he is, eternal and all-powerful and all-knowing and loving? So things like that. A book on St. Thomas Aquinas on the attributes of God is one I'd love to write someday. As far as my legacy, I would hope that someday when I'm gone, some people might pick up these books and say, I found something useful there, something that's helped me, or maybe something I've passed on to one of my friends or one of my children that's been helpful to them.
Marvelous. I know I've certainly benefited from your work, and I really appreciate you spending time talking to me today. I will link the works that you've done on your website in the description, and hopefully people can go there to follow up and maybe get a few of those books and see your many talks in EWTN or on YouTube and gain from your work as I have. So thank you very much, Dr. Vost, and I appreciate you being here.
You are most welcome, Marcus. It's been my pleasure.
God bless you.